Here's an example. So there are fewer Argonian and Khajiit mages in the higher echelon. That's okay. But here's something interesting about magical ability. First of all, it's very rare. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. If you look at the children, magically gifted humans, elves, beast folk.
Beast folk?
What?
Is that a term that we're still using?
Yes, obviously, the Argonians and Khajiit, they are folk who are beasts.
Okay, you're right. It's just some people feel it's derogatory.
It's a scientific term, Caius. I can't help how people feel about science.
Uh-huh. Okay, you're right. So, magically gifted children?
Yes, thank you. If you look at the children, magically gifted humans, elves, and beast folk are approximately as common. Now, there's a little bit of debate about that, because there is some evidence that maybe at the very upper extremes there's an Altmer advantage, just like there's an Orsimer disadvantage at the low end because, well, that's elves. That's the greater elven variability hypothesis. There have been academic scrolls published on this subject that have been suppressed because of the political ideology of the tribunal. In any case, the mURch, the elvish children who happen to be magically gifted, are less likely to also be combatively gifted. And that doesn't seem to be the case for the Argonians and the Khajiit. So if you're in particular a talented dunmer mage, then the Mages Guild is a pretty logical pathway for you because...
Because you don't have as many options.
Exactly, you don't have as many other options. Whereas if you're an Argonian or a Khajiit, you have other options. Because if you're a beast folk who is magically gifted, then you're more likely to also be combatively gifted. And so that's enough to, at least in principle, account for some of the reason why there are fewer Argonian and Khajiit mages than elvish mages.
So that explains why there are more dunmer in the Mages Guild and more Argonians and Khajiit in the Fighters Guild. What's that term they're using now? STEM?
STEM, yes. Sorcery, transmutation, enchanting, and magicianry. STEM. The STEM fields. Those Enwas over at the College of Winterhold are pushing that term because they're not affiliated with the Mages Guild.
It's not just Skyrim. What about Hammerfell? Aren't the Sword Singers claiming to be a STEM field too?
Caius, that's Red Guards. I'm not talking about Red Guards. Don't get me started on Red Guards. We're talking about beast folk. Say what you will about Red Guards, but they aren't beast folk.
Okay, so there are more dunmer in STEM, and that explains part of the septim gap.
Of course, practitioners of the STEM fields earn more septims than other professionals. So if there are more dunmer in STEM and fewer Khajiit and Argonians, that's a lot of the reason for the septim gap between mURch and beast folk.
So that's interesting. The options available in childhood are driving career choices.
There's lots of complex reasons like this, and so we have this reflexive idea, and this is very much the core idea among the Enwa neo-imperial types, is that if there's differences in outcome, then that's proof of prejudice. And that's support for the idea of the dunmeric tyranny, and that's like the core axiom of the radical Enwas is the dunmeric tyranny. As far as I'm concerned, that's another false god for these tribunal types. The supposed dunmeric tyranny, it's like, well, if it turns out that many of these differences in outcome between dunmer and Argonians and Khajiit aren't a consequence of the dunmeric tyranny, then you have to look at other reasons.
Such as?
Well, elves work longer hours. And I'm not saying that beast folk are lazy. I don't have to say that. We already know that. I'm just saying that elves work longer hours. That's what the data says. If you work 10% longer hours to make 40% more septims, that's a non-linear return, by the way. That's a good thing for everybody listening to know. You work that extra 10% because the return on that is non-linear, okay? Elves are more likely to work in dangerous businesses. They are more likely to run full-time businesses rather than part-time businesses. And they're more likely to change territories in pursuit of their career goals.
That makes sense. So if you're an adventurer, and you're born in Hammerfell, say, you're not going to get the best Dwemer artifacts because that's not where the Dwemer artifacts are.
That's right. If you move to Vardenfell, which I'm not recommending personally because there are already too many Enwas, but anyway, if one did that, they could get better Dwemer artifacts. Exactly.
Wow, right. You know, I saw this Red Guard carriage the other day,
Caius.
and it had the biggest Dwemer cog rims I have ever seen. I don't know how the thing could stay on the road. And he had like 6 lute players blasting out the most obnoxious music.
Caius, enough with the Red Guards already. Come on. So, like I was saying, these differences in temperament explain a lot. Did you know that Elvish Silt Strider drivers make 7% more septims? It's because they drive faster.
They take risks.
Exactly. And I'm not trying to romanticize or glorify elvish behavior. We already know that it's superior. I'm just explaining why the septum gap exists between the races. It's about ambition and competition. It's not prejudice.
Yeah, well, the competition amongst elves is fine. But competition with elves against Khajiit and Argonians is often thought of as cruel.
Obviously. Look, if a khajiit wants to join the Mages Guild, he can join the Mages Guild, but he can't expect to advance without competing against dunmer. So obviously, he's not going to advance.
Now let's talk about the Fighters Guild. This is my arena. I've been a member of the Blades my whole life. I'm a fighter. And there is a difference between elves and Khajiit and Argonians. And it's not to say that Khajiit and Argonians aren't competent. I mean, I had an Argonian in here the other day. He's in the Fighters Guild. His name is Right Wind. He's a good friend of mine. He doesn't fight against elves, and he shouldn't have to fight against elves, even though he probably could beat a bunch of elves in a fight.
Sure, a strong Argonian can beat many elves, but a strong Orsimer can beat every Argonian. That's the point.
You're right. The septum gap. There's a lot of factors at play here.
Right. And when you consider that beast folk really all ought to be slaves anyway, you see how ludicrous the debate is. Bunch of farm equipment,